This is 20 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is John Wagner, Laboratory Director at Idaho National Laboratory. John's going to give us a tour through some of the breakthrough research INL is doing to help the power system keep our lights on and our economy running. John began his almost three-decade career in 1997 as principal engineer with power sector hardware provider Holtec International. He then spent almost 17 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory studying nuclear power technologies. In 2016, he joined INL as chief scientist for the materials and fuels complex and then held director positions in the lab's expansive nuclear science and technology programs. He became INL's lab director in 2020. So, John, for starters, can you give us a sort of a quick overview of Idaho National Laboratory? I mean, how many scientists, how many programs, what's the budget? And ultimately, I got to ask you, how did one of the most important research facilities in the world, especially in nuclear technologies, happen in Idaho?
Well, that's a great question, and Herman, thanks for having me. I want to say that up front. So a lot in that question. Let me start with sort of the back part of it and move towards the front. So
Good.
in 1949, the site that is now called Idaho National Laboratory was formed as the National Reactor Testing Station. It
Mm,
had been previously a naval proving ground. There's a whole lot of interesting history there as well that I won't go into. And it was selected for a variety of reasons. There's great stories about the process, but a big portion is the fact that it was a remote location. And at that time, as a nation, as a world, we had not proven nuclear for power purposes. And so the whole idea, National Reactor Testing Station, was to prove out the principle of civilian nuclear power. Now, we ultimately ended up doing that in 1951. Famously, the experimental breeder reactor 1 lit 4 light bulbs, providing useful electricity. Multiple things happened after that. The first city powered by nuclear power. The Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program was out here on the site, demonstrating naval superiority globally for ever since. 52 different nuclear power or nuclear reactors, I shouldn't say all power reactors, were designed, built, and operated on the site, particularly in the 50s and 60s. And so that's our heritage. It was all about demonstrating nuclear power. Today, we're a multi-purpose laboratory. Nuclear energy is still our primary mission in the majority of the laboratory, but we also do a whole lot of work in other energy technologies, and even more so in our national homeland security area. Control system cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, physical security for critical infrastructure, in particular, grid reliability, resiliency, and assurance, et cetera. I'm sure we'll get into some of those topics. Today,
interesting.
we're annually just over $2 billion organization, and have been for the last several years. And we employ about 6,200 people. It fluctuates a little bit around that number. We've gone through a really rapid growth as the work that we do has been of strong interest, bipartisan, to the federal government and our sponsors.
Interesting. It occurred to me, I didn't realize it went back to 49. Not only was it remote in terms of the concerns about nuclear safety, but that time there was a lot of espionage going on and trying to find out what the U.S. was doing with nuclear, and so that probably made it a lot easier to secure that research, didn't it?
It probably did. It's hard for me to know, to be honest, but it wasn't as sort of secretive as like, for example, the weapons programs were.
Uh,
But yeah, definitely the remote location contributed to that benefit.
okay, so let's get to some of the specific programs, John. The first thing I want to say is everybody's talking about the pressure that data center electricity demand will put on the power system. Talk about it. INL is really doing stuff about it, and I think that's very interesting. Can you tell us about some of the programs to address data center demand? I know you're working with Amazon and other hyperscalers. You're modeling system and data center operational capabilities. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me back up and say one more thing about the laboratory to put that in context. So, there's 17 different national laboratories, and they each have their why they exist, their uniqueness, and their primary mission space. I mentioned nuclear is ours, but there's another key point that leads into your question, and that is that within that complex, that Department of Energy National Laboratory complex, we are what we consider an applied energy laboratory. Now, so not
Mm.
fundamental science. We do fundamental science, but that's not our primary work. And then I mentioned 890 square miles. So that gives us the space, the facilities, the infrastructure to do unique energy and national security research, development, and demonstration at scale. We literally have miles and miles of transmission line that we can segment off and do different things. We have full-scale critical infrastructure test ranges and we have think about it almost as a test bed laboratory for energy in national security. Now, then coming back to data centers, we have that kind of capability to bring into the problem space, if you will, in terms of grid reliability, fluctuations on the grid, and so forth. But then we also have modeling tools that we can use that infrastructure to test and demonstrate modeling tools on how to manage grid reliability, and again, all the different disruptions. Now, you mentioned Amazon and Microsoft. So we're finding on the nuclear energy side, all of these hyperscaler type companies, obviously they need a lot of power. We're probably going to talk at some point about power demand growth. And so what we find is this interesting intersection between nuclear for powering AI and AI infrastructure, and AI for accelerating development and ultimate deployment of nuclear. And so a number of these partnerships, like for example, with Microsoft and Amazon, are all about how do we accelerate the design and licensing of these nuclear systems with AI capabilities like Amazon Bedrock and their cloud services and so forth. And then on top of that, we've got all of our grid expertise in terms of modeling and actually full-scale demonstration that we can bring to those questions as well. Then, I mean, there's so much going on. And then another thing is the Department of Energy, this administration, as they have wanted to encourage further AI infrastructure development and deployment, one of the tools that they're deploying is making Department of Energy land available to companies that are interested in siting AI infrastructure with co-located power generation. So Idaho National Laboratory was identified as the first of those Department of Energy sites to go out with what the department calls a request for applications, where private companies would come in and they propose those projects to be sited on our laboratory. So we're working with a number of companies in that realm as well. I'll stop there just because I mean I could almost go on and on. There's so much happening in this space right now.
Well, you're not going to be able to stop there because I'm going to ask you to expand on some of that research that you guys have. But I just want to clarify. So you have this modeling capability. So you have scientists, and they look at the problems that hyperscalers have with electricity demand, data center demand. And for instance, there's a lot of talk about flexibility of data centers. So before I get to my next question, what you're saying is that you can model what a data center's flexibility potentially could be, but then you have the room to build facilities, I guess, that actually see if the operational capabilities that you've modeled will work. Is that essentially something like what you're talking about
That's
there?
exactly right. And by the way, I do want to add that, we don't do this all alone. We work with a lot of different utility partners, grid operators, even some states that are interested in understanding what this means to them. So there's a lot of different companies and entities involved. So I want to make sure that's clear. But there's two sort of big areas I could break down the demonstration in, and that is we have multiple nuclear projects. As I maybe I didn't really get into that, but we've got a whole lot of new nuclear projects on the site progressing. A number of these are, in fact, most of these are with private company partners, and those private company partners see AI data centers as an opportunity as their customers. And so, whether it's our Marvel reactor, which we're doing as a Department of Energy project, or several of these private companies, we're looking to pair small scale data centers with these reactors to get that data and flesh that out and then scale up. So that's a whole area for us and has multiple projects. Then on the other side of it, I mentioned the opportunity to use our land. Those would be pretty much commercial only projects that would come in and with commercial power generation and commercial data centers, they would scale up what they need. So there's sort of two big lanes there, if you will.
Mm. Okay, now the other side of meeting this electricity demand growth, and it's still uncertain, but the one thing we know is it's growing. And you have to be able to, once you've got the concept, you've used your land and resources to prove the concept, you've still got to get the opportunity to build these plants. I know you're working with Microsoft on ways to streamline the permitting process. There's a bill in Congress that hit some political hurdles and may not get through. But there's ways to make permitting work better for nuclear plants, and INL's working on those. You're also, as I understand it, working on accelerating plant deployments. In other words, just how can we build these things faster? And I understand you're also working on, eh, I guess, in policy work on developing better data so that regulatory approvals can be made faster. There's a whole spectrum of things that you're doing. Can you tell us just a little bit about those things? I know we could talk about them all afternoon, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, but it's a great space to talk in here. So again, I'll start at the end and move back forward.
Sure.
One of the things that has been a challenge for nuclear projects, of course, you think about any power project, ultimately somebody's making a financial decision to choose one power form over another. There's options. And one of the challenges with private sector dollars investing in nuclear power plants and utilities deciding to commit to building more nuclear has been the uncertainty in the time frames. And the uncertainty in the time frame and cost is just as important as the time and cost themselves into making these decisions. And traditionally, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has taken a long time, required a lot of expense to get through that process. And again, that uncertainty and how long will it take to get through that process, that's been a significant barrier to anybody wanting to commit to new nuclear. And so what we've done is, of course, as a laboratory, we've always focused on technology solutions that will help these kinds of things. But in the last several years, we and I personally have engaged more in the policy space in terms of regulatory requirements. Those with a particular intersection into where Congress could take action, where the NRC has to do the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has to do what they're doing because it's written, for example, in the Atomic Energy Act. And so we've published a couple of reports at the request of House Energy and Commerce to provide recommendations for statutory changes that could be made. Some of those showed up in the Advance Act that was signed into law 2 years ago this summer. And so that's an area. Then working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on what I'd call sort of modernizing what the regulatory requirements should be. We now have a lot. We have more than 5 decades of operational experience with our nuclear fleet. We've learned a lot, and so in some cases, I would say some of the initial assumptions that were made, requirements, were overly conservative because we didn't have that kind of operational years of experience. Now we do. And so now we can start to take credit for that and do that. And so that's a big improvement. Now going back again to the Amazon and Microsoft work, what there's a lot there, but at a high level, what I'd say is these AI tool capabilities are very, very effective at accelerating document preparation, checking document preparation for the requirements that they need to meet. And it's not just on the nuclear kind of regulatory commission, like licensing application areas, also on the environmental assessments that go along with any big project like a nuclear project. And so the key focus there is how do we use these capabilities to dramatically reduce what has traditionally been a very manual effort in terms of preparing this documentation and preparing it with all the right information that's needed to be successful in those reviews.
Interesting. Yeah, I've done a little bit of reporting on the way that AI is being used to help nuclear technology along. I know that there's a company in San Francisco Bay Area that is working with the Pacific Gas and Electric on the Diablo Canyon plant. It was nearing its end of life, and the California is trying to keep it going. And one of the things they're doing is using this AI technology to go through there and look at the plant's capabilities, functional capabilities, precise way that can reassure that yeah, it's been around a long time, but it still is working okay. I don't know if you guys have done anything like that. And the other thing that I've heard is that the AI capabilities are being used to just go through all of the NRC Nuclear Regulatory Commission documents and just digest everything that's ever been studied, so that, like you say, they can learn from what's been done before. Just
Right.
briefly before we move on to the last question, have you guys done that kind of work?
Yes, in fact, again, we're working with multiple partners on that. We already talked about Microsoft, and they've been doing exactly what you were just describing. And then there's I'll call it a startup company, Atomic Canyon, that is working in
That's
this
the
space
one.
as well. I think that's the one you're referring to.
Yeah.
And so we've been working with those. And these large language models are particularly well suited to these kinds of problems. And then I would like to say that we're going well beyond that.
Mm.
So you may have heard of the Department of Energy's Genesis mission, and I don't want to go too far into this, but this is Department of Energy and broader federal government-wide AI applications for accelerating energy and security outcomes. What we're doing in there and within the laboratory and with other lab partners is looking at how, and we have a project, we call it Project Prometheus. How would we accelerate with AI the design, the licensing document preparation, and all the information that goes into that, including approval, manufacturing of reactors, robotic assembly of reactors, and then ultimately autonomous operation of reactors, all of that entire cycle with as little human intervention as possible and as required. You're going to want some human intervention in parts of that, but how much of that can we use AI to accelerate and then to automate?
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing what can be done. I just thought of something. Everyone's afraid of the rise of the bots, and if they get too smart, they'll take over. In those applications that you're describing, they need the electricity to stay on to keep themselves going, these bots. So it's in their self-interest to do what we want them to do. But I don't, I'm just joking. I don't want to go too far into that. If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.